gosh, guys. I was talking to you for like 10 minutes and I had not started to record. Oh well, you get to miss all of the stupid things I said, which included not knowing what book I was supposed to review because holy cow, it's been a time. But the book is The Book Jumper by, wait for it, I still can't pronounce her name. She's German and I still can't pronounce it. Mechthild Gläser? If somebody out there knows, please correct me. I have already done the Forgotten book. I want to say I was beyond pleasantly surprised by The Book Jumper because I wasn't impressed when I first started. I like to say that if I could put the Forgotten book and The Book Jumper together, it would be the perfect book because the beginning of the Forgotten book was exceptional to me and the end kind of trailed off. The Book Jumper, the beginning was blah, and the end was amazing. It's one of those instances where I'm glad I stuck with it. I was so unimpressed by the beginning that I was like, do I want to finish it? Not really. I'm trying to remember how long it took me to read the Forgotten book. 2, maybe 3 days. The Book Jumper, when I actually sat down to read it, 5 hours? Granted, I did skim a little, but I was verklempt. I could not believe how much I enjoyed this book. I stayed up till 2 in the morning reading this book. Let's talk about the book. The Forgotten book was about a teenage girl who found a book that when you wrote in it, the things you wrote came true. The Book Jumper is about a teenage girl who learns that she has the ability to jump into books. Pretty self-explanatory. I will say, however, that was one of the major faults for me because I didn't think that talent was well articulated. Yes, she has the ability to enter a story, but what then? I get it, the grand scheme of things is to make sure that the characters and the story align with what they're supposed to do. So the main character, what is her name? Amy! The main character, Amy, is living in Germany with her mother. Her mother had run away from home pregnant at 17, so home is Scotland. She runs away to Germany, raises Amy up, and then there's this horrible, that's another thing, a totally dropped subplot. There's this event, 2 catastrophic events that happen in each of their lives simultaneously. For Amy, it was something at school, some sort of humiliation. And then with her mother, Alexis, who kind of bothered me. I understand that Alexis was young when she had Amy, but it kind of bothered me that she asked Amy to call her Alexis. I don't know, call me old school, but Alexis, she's not mom at all in this book. It is Alexis. She had been having an affair with a married man, and then he decides not to leave his family for her. Which, why am I supposed to care about that? Why is that supposed to tug at my heartstrings and say, oh, poor Alexis, you homewrecker? Maybe you have a different view on infidelity, but to me, he's married. You have no claim to him. Yes, it's crappy what he did to you. He led you on and he joined your family essentially, but he decided to stay with his wife. You made the poor decision to get involved with him in the first place. Anyway, this guy is someone that Amy really loved. He was part of their family. He was essentially a father figure to her. So she was devastated too. This I do not understand. We don't know why Alexis left home, except that something terrible had happened. She couldn't go and stay there, and she thought her entire family was crazy. Yet, when the two of them have these catastrophic events occur in their lives, the first place she thinks to go is home. It's been 17 years. Couldn't they have gone to America? I know the book would not have happened if they'd gone to America, but that's why I think the beginning of the Book Jumper was relatively weak. I didn't understand why she chose to bring them to her ancestral home. And then when Amy learns she's a book jumper, not only am I like, well, what's your role as a book jumper? I could not believe that Amy was like, okay, I'm a book jumper. This is supposed to be something fantastical set in the real world. Aside from the fact that she loves to read and loves the idea that she could be part of her stories, it should have taken more convincing than it did, which it took no convincing. What happens is they get there. It's like, legitimately, this town is not a town. There's nothing there. And then there's Amy's family as well as this other family atop a hill. The other family lives in a castle. Her family lives in a mansion. So they're trudging through the wet and the mud up to this mansion. They walk in and she meets her formidable grandmother, which I cannot pronounce her name, so please don't ask me. The grandmother says, okay, Alexis, you guys can stay, but on one condition. She has to read books. Amy's like, I mean, why is that such a bad thing? And Alexis is like, oh no. So that's not bad, where you're like, this shouldn't be something that Alexis would have a problem with, but she does. But then the next day, the news is broken to Amy that she can book jump. She's automatically taken to this hidden library underground to learn how to be a book jumper. She's legitimately sitting through classes throughout her summer break. And so for me, I would have been like, okay, granted, if it's something really interesting, I might not have thought about it at school. It would have been something fun for me. That's not what this feels like. From the get-go, she doesn't complain. So even then, I could see her being like, I'll give it a shot. This could be interesting. And then over time being like, oh no. Or vice versa, being like, you want me to do what on my summer break? I don't think so. Anybody know where that's from? We're introduced to her teacher, this guy named Glenn, as well as these other two monk-type figures. Couldn't tell you what their names were, except this one guy, Desmond, had a greater role later on. But the whole purpose of this secret library is so that the book jumpers could take care of the stories. They could keep the stories in line. It should house every story known to man so that they have access to every story known to man. So Amy, who is a Lennox, is also introduced to two other teenagers who are in this summer school, Will and some other girl. What is her name? I can't remember anybody's name today. Betsy. Will and Betsy. They are cousins. They are the McAllisters. They live in the castle. But the McAllisters and the Lennoxes had been sworn enemies, but they're the two families that can book jump. So they're sort of just bound by circumstances. However, centuries earlier, there had been this incident in which their arguing had caused the destruction of a rare and a unique manuscript. In order to protect literature, they built this secret library, and the two families come together and they learned how to book jump. And the thing is, you can only book jump until you're like mid-20s, 30s, something like that. Amy is supposed to learn how to book jump. And the one thing that her grandmother had gotten, or Alexis had gotten her grandmother to agree to, was that, okay, she'll book jump, but only into a kid's story. I mean, still, it's kind of intriguing. It's like, okay, what's the difference? So she chooses the jump book. We are told nothing about what she's supposed to do there. Okay, so this is when I read it the first time, and then, I took this big, this sabbatical, if you will, from the book. So I'm sure it tells us exactly what she was supposed to do. Does she do it? Absolutely not. And I thought this was strange, like hugely suspect in terms of plotting. On her first day, she jumped by herself. If I were Glenn, if I were any of these book jumpers, I would be so worried, because she's gone her entire life not knowing what she can do, not even knowing it's possible. And then the first day that she even knows what she can do, they throw her into a book. So my thought is, Okay, yeah, law and order. Make sure that characters are doing what they're supposed to do, because Betsy, I think her story that she's been working on, and when they say working on, it's like they do one story for an eternity before moving on to the next. So again, I'm like, what do you mean working on? Like, are you bound to one story your entire life? How long does it take to create law and order, you know? But her book is Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and apparently one of the dwarves wants to open up an ice cream shop. So this is what I'm thinking, all right, the book, the characters have a mind of their own, and we have to make sure that they stay to task. So Betsy has got to make sure that this dwarf does not leave his dwarf brothers and Snow White, because that does not go along with the plot. We do learn that books can be ruined, like the stories can miss chunks of their stories, like because Will, his best friend, was Sherlock Holmes, and he broke the rules, and he would bring Sherlock into the real world, and then Sherlock dies. So granted, there are a lot of different Sherlock Holmes books. This one was Hound of the Baskervilles. So majority of Hound of the Baskervilles, anything involving Sherlock, disappeared. And then in the end, I guess what was agreed upon was the other Sherlocks would then take his place. But for me, that doesn't make sense, because when are they taking his place? Because what we do see when she goes into the book and she finds this place called the Margins is that characters, when it's not their storyline, they can leave and do whatever they want. But Sherlock Holmes is kind of the main character. I haven't actually read any Sherlock Holmes books, so I can't say what those look like, but it didn't quite make sense to me how this all is supposed to work out, and that just goes back to the whole book jumping thing. I thought needed a lot more development. As I said, she goes in the Jungle Book, and she's all excited, and then Shere Khan finds her, and I'm like, okay, Shere Khan is the bad guy, she's gonna get into some trouble. No, Shere Khan apparently is just a character, or like he's just an actor playing his role, but when he's not playing the role of Shere Khan, he's just, you know, a nice tiger. He tells her, don't mess with the plot. You mess with the plot, you mess with the story. They like walk and talk, and then this is something else I don't understand. The way that you move through the story is not explained. Like in my mind, she's walking through jungle, but somehow she's walking through pages, and eventually we see the characters purposefully turning the pages. So what I'm seeing in my mind's eye is she's walking through the jungle only to end up in the margins. She can go whichever way she wants to different stories, and so then I'm like, is this an anthology? Is this a bunch of stories put together? Are all the stories connected somehow? You just have to get to the right crossroads? How does this all work? Because I got the impression that that's not how it works. That somehow her crossroads would lead to certain stories, but not all stories. So, like for me, if I'm in the Jungle Book, how do I get to another completely physically separate book? There was a lot left to be desired with that part of the storytelling. She gets into the margins and she meets this guy named Werther, who is being tormented by the witches from Macbeth. Werther, I have never heard of this book either. I can't even remember what it's called right now. But his book, his story, he unrequited love and then he kills himself. So he's super sad, just really melancholy. He likes the drink, you know what I'm saying? So they go to this margin town where all kinds of characters will show up in their off time. And yeah, so she's hanging out with him and they kind of do some things, and that sets the tone where she and Werther become besties. But she returns to her own time and place, and everybody's so worried about her. And Betsy, who is not nice, she's an antagonist of sorts, is like, oh, well, we thought you died. Like, we didn't think you'd be able to make it back. So to me, well then why just send her unchaperoned? If you didn't think, one, she was prepared, and two, she was capable of doing it by herself. And the thing about book jumping is there is this, in my mind, it's like Stonehenge. So above the secret library is this circle of stones, and then within that circle, and I'm assuming it's like within the windows, not necessarily in the center. This is where the book jumpers, they lie down, put the book on their face, they go into the book. Well, Amy goes home and she's reading Oliver Twist. She gets the wild idea to put her e-reader on her face, and she learns that she can book jump from anywhere. Here's a spoiler. I was really intrigued by this, and part of me was wondering, does that mean she's just a super book jumper? Like, is there something special about her? What it is her father is actually Desmond, one of the monks, and Desmond is a book character. So here's like a really big spoiler. His book was the manuscript that had been destroyed centuries earlier when the two clans had been fighting, because it had fallen into the fire and burned. What they were able to do was they saved him, Glenn, the teacher, and then the third monk guy. Now they live in the real world. So it's been like 500 years that they've been living in the real world, but they don't age, they don't sleep, they don't eat, but apparently he can father a child, which is something that, again, it was a little underdeveloped, where we don't learn until over halfway through the book that he's her dad. And then they have this quaint little excursion to the mainland, and they're sitting like at a bistro or something, and he's saying, I'm so proud of who you've become. I'm like, you don't even know her. You've only known her for like a month. He's saying how happy he is because he never would have had the chance to be a father in his story, because that was a part of his storyline. It was really cool the way that Gläser played with that, with the idea of book characters being able to live outside of their book, but at the same time, there was just so much more that could have been done with it. And anyways, that's why she can jump from anywhere, is because she's not human. She's not entirely human. The laws of book jumping don't apply to her, even to the extent that she might be able to book jump forever. She might be able to book jump longer than normal book jumpers. She might be able to book jump only as long as a normal book jumper could jump. And then this is something I don't quite understand either, and we're sort of backtracking here, is why Alexis decided to stop book jumping, except for the fact that she didn't like her family. I was under the impression, I think she said her favorite book was Anna Karenina. Sorry, I can't pronounce that either. And she does mention how she couldn't stand watching Anna do what she does, because I guess Anna, like Sherlock, was her best friend, and then she knew that she could never have a future with Desmond because he doesn't age. I was expecting this big reveal from Alexis, and we didn't get that. And then, even though she's completely heartbroken, and Amy has this great point when she first spots the two together, because Desmond is like 18 and Alexis is 34, so she's appalled to see her mother with this younger man. But Alexis, it's like she's completely forgotten about Dominic, the guy who broke her heart, which is the perfect point that Amy made, and is fooling around with this 18-year-old kid. I get it. They were in love before, but I did think it was an awfully big leap emotionally for her, which is when I kind of wish that Gläser had toned down the effect of the affair, like how much Alexis was in love with this other guy, that she could acknowledge that it wasn't going to work. He wasn't the guy. What they'd been doing was wrong. Anything to tone down how attached to him she was, like how in love they were and how devastated she was when he broke it off. Amy jumps into Oliver Twist. She's in the scene where they're starving and they're like, oh hey, go get more gruel from the guy dishing out the gruel. And she's like, wait a minute. And this is the first time that, well, not first, technically this is the second. And they're like, oh my gosh, you're a book jumper. And so for me, I thought it was strange that the characters would know this. My assumption is that they'd essentially forget every single time they would encounter a book jumper because they're in their story. So I would think that they're just going along with their story until, oh my gosh, who is that guy? But all these characters know that she's a book jumper. So again, it's just underdeveloped, but she's like, oh, here's some stale biscuits. And yeah, I hope this doesn't ruin your story. So the next day, she meets up with her classmates and Glenn, and something strange is happening. She's like, oh my gosh, did I ruin something by giving these orphans food? And no, it wasn't. Honestly, I don't even remember what the problem was, but she was not at fault. And things are going along, and she's continuing to book jump, continuing to get closer to Will, when really strange things start happening. So Alice in Wonderland, the White Rabbit is gone, or the idea of the White Rabbit. There is still a White Rabbit, but he is just a White Rabbit. He doesn't have his waistcoat, he doesn't have his clock, he's not late. Ergo, the idea for Alice in Wonderland is gone. This continues to happen with various stories. The main idea is stolen, which means that book can't exist. Amy is trying to figure out who's doing it. There's this hooded figure that nobody can catch because they are insanely fast, but nobody wants to believe her either because she can't admit that she's been book jumping outside of class because she's not allowed to book jump outside of class. And then Will is so at the beginning of the book, we open with this character on a cliff overlooking the stormy waves, trying to find someone. We learn that it is Will who is trying to find Sherlock. At some point in the novel, he and Amy do discover Sherlock, who washes up on the beach, and he's dead. And so Will feels so guilty because one, it was his best friend, and two, he was at fault for bringing him out of his book. So he vows never to book jump again. So he doesn't believe Amy when she's trying to tell him somebody is stealing from the different stories, because he's like, no, like, you're just doing things you're not supposed to do. Are you sure you're not messing with stuff and you're the problem? Eventually, she does convince him, and he concedes to book jump with her. It goes nowhere, but then Amy and Werther are still hot on the trail. They almost catch the thief in the metamorphosis, but Amy, who apparently is extremely clumsy, trips over the main character, and the thief gets away. Now they're like, well, what do we do? And then Werther tells her that he and a friend, because he has a lot of pen pals, have come up with this idea that the thief is probably trying to steal main ideas from a set amount of books, because you can steal 10 ideas, then you can create your own story. So they conclude, here's something of a spoiler, that it must be somebody from that lost manuscript trying to recreate the manuscript. So by stealing elements, they're able to make their story come back to life. Here's where I had a problem. And you get, oh my gosh, there's so many ideas in my head. In the book, every chapter, we get an insert, which eventually you realize it is an insert from this lost manuscript, which there, aside from the characters that they rescued, there are a few charred pieces. Eventually you learn that these inserts or excerpts are from this lost manuscript from the medieval times, and it's about a princess and a knight and a monster, and it's actually really, really interesting once you get into the book. At first I was like, yawn, but eventually I really got into it. But Desmond was the knight. Once Amy learns the truth about him and her parentage, and then she learns, hey, or she and Werther, I was like, maybe this is what's going on. Will goes to talk to Glenn. She goes to talk to Desmond, and Desmond refuses to speak of it. And then when we get back to Will, or we get back with Will, it's like he never even went to talk to Glenn. And so that was something else I had an issue with, was the way that certain storylines or ideas jumped. it was like a cut thread where you think it's gonna do this, and then all of a sudden somebody snips it, and we start a new thread. Desmond gives her nothing except for the fact that he's too traumatized by his storyline to be able to talk about it, which I thought was incredibly dissatisfying. It does play into the ultimate reveal, the ultimate plot, but I was like, you can't even give us an idea as to what your book is about, except that it took place in the medieval times, you were a knight, there was a princess and a monster. Like, you can't even give us a general outline. Okay. We go, and then we start hearing about somebody is jumping when they're not supposed to. And this is twofold. So here are some more spoilers. One, which completely underdeveloped, completely unnecessary in my opinion. Betsy had teamed up with Amy's grandmother because basically both families were going broke. So Amy's grandmother had enlisted Betsy to go into certain stories like King Midas or Aladdin, where there were characters with loads of wealth and steal, so that the coffers could stay coffered full. I know coffered's not really a word. Will and Amy discover there's something going on with them, and I am totally on board with Betsy being the bad guy. Technically, it did cross my mind that the actual bad guy was the bad guy, but we'll leave that for a couple minutes from now. But I was totally team Betsy's bad. Then we learn, oh no, she, for some reason, out of the goodness of her heart, decided to help the Lennoxes financially. The grandmother gets cold feet about this, and these are sort of red herrings, because as ideas are being stolen from books, other books are literally being stolen from as well, and it turns out that the books that are being literally stolen from is just Betsy and the grandmother colluding to get money. The grandmother feels too guilty, so she has Betsy return everything, and then they are supposed to have a rendezvous only for her to be attacked. And this is another little thing that kept happening, is near-death experiences for Amy. Amy determines that her grandmother, who does survive, it was a case of mistaken identity. They'd been wearing similar sweaters, and this would-be murderer attacked her thinking she was Amy. We have the other person who has been stealing from the books, who has been book jumping. So that is actually kind of tricky too, because then Will and Amy discover this urchin, this little girl who is obviously an orphan and has not taken a bath in a while, hasn't eaten probably in even longer. So they catch her, but she acts like she can't speak to them, that she doesn't understand what they're saying. They all fall asleep, and then the little girl gets away. So then we see her here and there and everywhere, and then finally Will and Amy, I think I was skimming a little bit at this point, because the really great parts of the novel surrounded the mystery. I didn't care about exposition about their families and things like that. But they decide to go on a hunt trip. They're gonna go catch them some rabbits. They end up in a cave because they're along a coastline, and in this cave they discover a nest of sorts, like somebody had been asleep for a very long time. The foliage had grown over them, and now they have emerged. But what is left in this nest is a crown, a diadem, a tiara with rubies inlaid into it. And this is when they realize, for sure, there's something going on with the story, and then that is when they go to talk to their people, and we get absolutely no information from it. They determine that this urchin hanging around the island must be the princess from the novel, and that she is the one stealing ideas because she wants to recreate her novel. Because like I told you, the characters, Glenn and Desmond, they don't sleep, they don't eat. Like every, I don't know, 100 years or so, they'll take a really long nap. And for some reason, this girl who nobody knew had escaped the story slept for like 500 years. She was semi-conscious of what was was going on, and she vowed that when she did wake up, she would find a way to bring her story back to life. So this is her plan. She doesn't care who gets in her way, and we realize she's not innocent whatsoever. She might look young, but she is evil and old. She is somebody who's been around a long time. And this is when we start weaving in with those excerpts from that fairy tale, because the princess is not so good. The princess is actually quite evil. And then here is another spoiler in that the monster, so Desmond is both the knight and the monster. She sets the knight off to destroy the monster, only for the knight to realize he has to destroy himself. She's super evil, and I was loving it. But the problem is, she couldn't possibly have been the thief, because they were close enough to realize she is not the right build and height to be that thief. So who is the thief? There is another character named Brock, which actually, let me tangent for just a second, because very early in the story, Will and Amy go to the local pub, and she meets her uncle. Do we ever hear from her uncle ever again? Have we ever heard of her uncle? Absolutely not. And he says, well, why would she talk about me? So it's like, why did we need an uncle? In any case, that leads back to this character named Brock, who I thought was going to play a bigger part. Brock has some mental deficiencies. He just counts all the time. He doesn't communicate, but all he does is count, and he sends Will's parents a letter. And the thing with Will's parents is, depending on who you're talking to, they abandoned him. What they really did was, like, they didn't want to be part of book jumping anymore, and they gave him a choice. And he said, I do want to be a book jumper, so you guys can leave, and I'm going to stay here. But Brock sent them this letter. It was really more of a picture, which, when the picture was described, first, it was said it was little more than a child's drawing, but it was exceptionally detailed for a child's drawing with wax crayons. Will has no notion of this letter that had supposedly been sent to him. He realizes that the laird, who is Betsy's dad, grandpa, something like that, but he's the guy who's in charge of the McAllister clan in the castle, had stolen the letter and kept it for himself. But what the letter or the picture is basically all of our characters in a circle around Will, and Will is bending over Sherlock's body, and then Brock is pointing to the people. What is actually happening is Brock is pointing to Will, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Brock, I thought that his eccentricities were, I don't know, maybe he was a storybook character too, or maybe something about him doesn't function well here, but in the context of what's going on, he'll be a major player. No. But what he does manage to do is he manages to capture the princess. I have no idea how, considering she is quicker than anything. He, for all intents and purposes, is this hulky, bulky kid or dude. I think he's like 14 or something. I don't know how he captures her, but he manages to lock her in the dungeon of the McAllister castle. Our dynamic duo go down, try to talk to her, and she gives them nothing. But the next thing we know, she's been released. They had been waiting for Werther because they were still waiting for, like, the last story to be pilfered from. Again, they both fall asleep, and so she wakes up to see Werther has come into Peter Pan, which is the book that they were going to be watching for his message. He's like, oh my gosh, it's happening, she's stealing the monster from the Odyssey. She goes to help him with that. Will is nowhere to be seen. And then we get to Will's perspective. He's either at that book jumping site at the secret library, or he's at McAllister Castle in the dungeon. In any case, he realizes that the princess has escaped. He has no clue how, and then he does end up at the secret library, which, side note, the manuscript has been stolen, or the pieces of the manuscript have been stolen, and this is where he finds the princess. He's acting really odd, like he doesn't, like he's been drugged, and so if you're not picking up what I'm putting down, he is the thief. She, at some point, she had woken up. When he passed by, she poisoned him, still unclear as to this. You get the impression that she has powers outside of her book, which now that I'm thinking of that, I don't understand, because from what I do understand, like there's something special about them once they're outside of their books. Somehow she is able to poison his mind so that he is now controlled by her. She gets him to steal things from the stories when he's asleep. So all of these nightmares that he's been having, which I'm just saying, there weren't nearly enough nightmares, nearly enough clues to clue me in to the fact that he was involved. I thought that could have been developed a bit better as well. But Amy appears and she's like, what's going on here? And the princess says, well, you're gonna help me recreate my story. And Amy's like, I think not. The girl pulls out the picture of Dorian Gray and she's like, if you don't, I'm going to destroy this. And if it's destroyed, you can't get it back. If you can't get it back, then the idea for that book is gone. Well, she does. Sidebar, those witches from Macbeth are able to like draw a passable imitation of it to keep the story going. Don't really know how much I believe about that, just by virtue of how things are explained in this novel as to how things work, but whatever. So this convinces Amy enough to jump into the story with Will and the princess. And at this point, we don't actually know that Will is the thief. He is kind of going along with Amy, going along with the princess. So they get into the story, and in the distance, a village is burning. Is it burning because the book was burning? Is it burning because that's part of the story? So yes, the princess begins to bring the book back to life. She shows, or she reveals, that Will is her thief and that Will is going to be her new knight, which I was a little surprised that she didn't try to get the 3 original characters. She was very upset with them for not trying to get this book back in order in the 500 years she'd been asleep. So I would have thought, just out of vengeance, she would have kidnapped them and brought them back into the story. She doesn't, but she does have Will try to kill Amy. Amy is able to kind of break through his fog. He realizes, which is when, again, we're coming back to those little excerpts, that the only way to stop this is to kill himself. So that's what he does. And then Amy is able to escape with all of the ideas, sans the princess, back to the real world, but Will is dead. She then takes him into Peter Pan, where Tinkerbell heals him. There's enough of his soul left that she can bring him back to life in the book. He cannot return to the real world, and Amy is left in a conundrum. We're getting into an epilogue of sorts, where she recaps things, but the ultimate idea, because she and Will had fallen in love. I forgot to mention that, which it might have been obvious. But the idea is that he'll be 17 forever. He's never gonna grow up, so it's mirroring Alexis and Desmond. Amy's choice eventually will be, because when she can no longer book jump, she will no longer be able to see Will again. So her choice is stay rooted in reality or live out the rest of her life in fantasy. It's an interesting cliffhanger of sorts. She and Alexis, I'm assuming, decide to stay on the island. There had been a point in the story where Alexis was like, you know, we were only here for a short time. It's not like I kept that secret. I'm assuming they do stay so that Alexis can be with Desmond and then Amy can book jump or whatever. This brings me to my point of, what was my point? I remembered it and then I forgot it. Whew, there was a minute there. I thought I had talked again for like 30 minutes without recording, but I was wrong. But what I could not remember, but wanted to remember and then did remember, oh yes, and then forgot for a second, but now remember. We know about why Alexis wanted to come home, and we sort of knew why Amy wanted to get away. And eventually, what's revealed, and it was the most underwhelming revelation I have ever experienced in my whole entire life. She'd been on a field trip. They were playing Truth or Dare, and one of the guys acted like kissing her was the worst thing in the world. That's embarrassing. I'm not going to downplay the mortification or the emotional consequences of that or repercussions of that. But I was thinking, okay, and then granted, for some reason her best friend posted naked pictures of her. I do not understand how any of this ties into anything and why it happened. But I was like, that's what I was like. I don't even have words for how underwhelmed and confused I was concerning why she was treated so poorly by her peers. I don't know. Again, like, there were so many underdeveloped elements of this story. The end was amazing. And then the end of the book is the princess is thinking, actually, let me read it to you. The princess stood on the highest battlement of the highest tower and looked out at the sea of flames. Stories were strange things. 1 minute they were over. The next minute, you simply turned back to the beginning and everything began again. 1 minute, the princess had lost everything. The next, she thought she could already spy a new knight in the distance, coming to rescue her. She smiled as she waited for him. I thought that was fantastic. Because the idea that a book is never really over, because it's over until you start it again, blows my mind. It's not a new concept, but when I sit down and think about it, my mind is blown. I did wonder, however, where this new knight is coming from. Because if her manuscript is destroyed, and I don't quite know if anybody discovered the pieces of it that she had stolen, or if this is an instance of the margins, getting to certain manuscripts via the margins. But I'm like, who is this knight? Is he a book jumper? Is he a townsfolk? Like, who is this person? Where are they coming from is my bigger question. But I loved how it's not over. We think it's over, but it's not over. The very last note, I could not figure out, this lost story sounds truly horrific. So with that in mind, I could understand why none of the characters wanted to retell it. But I couldn't figure out why, if you have these characters who know the story, why they cannot just recount the story and it be rewritten. I'm sure some things would have gotten lost in the cracks, but it didn't make sense to me how this manuscript that people can remember the plot for can be lost forever. I really enjoyed how it was woven through and how it became far bigger of a deal than we'd expected. But in my opinion, it didn't need to be lost. Yeah, that's it. I really enjoyed the book jumper. I do recommend it. Please give it some grace in the beginning. Please give it some grace as to lack of development, because the end is totally worth it. What do you think? If you've read it, let me know and let's have a discussion. Talk to you later. Bye.